I was already late when I pulled onto the shoulder, my suit meant for chandeliers and handshakes, not asphalt and steam. An elderly woman stood alone beside a disabled luxury car, traffic rushing past as if she were invisible. I fixed what I could with my bare hands. Grease sank into my cuffs. Time slipped away. I chose to keep going, stained and quiet, because sometimes you finish what you start. That decision followed me into a house where status mattered more than intent. I was inspected before I was welcomed. Announced before I was seated. Set aside because I looked like the road. My own family watched, and said nothing. What they didn't know was who would arrive next, or what kindness costs when it's done without witnesses. By the time the truth walked through the door, everything they measured me by had turned inside out. If you've ever been judged for doing the right thing, if you've ever been humiliated for showing up as you are, stay with me. Subscribe if you want stories told slowly and honestly. And if you've lived a moment like this, tell me in the comments. I read every one. I had left the house early that afternoon with the kind of careful attention you give to things that matter less than they claim to. The event was hosted by my son-in-law's family, framed as a corporate gathering but held under the softer language of family obligation. A large house, a long driveway, names that carried weight in rooms I only entered occasionally. I dressed for it without enthusiasm, dark suit, white shirt, shoes polished more out of habit than pride. I wasn't there to impress anyone. I was there because absence would be remembered more harshly than presence. The highway was thin with late daylight, that muted gold that settles before evening. I was thinking about nothing in particular when I saw the car ahead on the shoulder, dark paint, expensive lines, hazard lights blinking with a kind of helpless patience. I passed it at first, the way people do when they tell themselves someone else will stop. Then I noticed the woman standing beside it. She was elderly, slight, her coat buttoned wrong, one sleeve longer than the other. She stood a careful distance from traffic, hands folded, eyes following each car as it rushed by without slowing. There was no phone in her hand. No one with her. Just the quiet dignity of someone waiting longer than they expected to. I pulled over without ceremony. The car was newer than mine by a decade, all gloss and complexity under the hood. The problem, however, was simple enough, something loose, something starved of attention rather than broken. I worked slowly, deliberately. Years of fixing what I could, when I could, came back without effort. My fingers blackened. My cuffs darkened. Time moved the way it always does when you're not watching it closely. She thanked me more than was necessary. I waved it off, closed the hood, and watched her drive away before returning to my own car. Only then did I notice the state of my hands, the streaks on my sleeves, the faint smell of oil that had settled into the fabric. I sat there longer than I should have, engine idling, considering the obvious choice. I could turn back. I could go home, change, send a polite message about traffic and regret. No one would question it. In those rooms, people like me were expected to have excuses ready. Instead, I wiped my hands with a paper towel that did very little, and pulled back onto the highway. There are moments when you know you're making a decision that will cost you something. You don't always know how much. You just know it will not be free. I arrived late. The driveway was already full, cars lined with an intentional symmetry meant to signal arrival order and importance. I parked farther back, stepped out, and adjusted my jacket, as if that might restore something that had already been noticed. At the door, I paused. Not out of hesitation, out of habit. The kind you develop when you've learned to take in a room before it takes you in. I rang the bell. The door opened just wide enough for me to be seen before I was acknowledged. My son-in-law's mother stood there, framed by warm light and polished wood, her posture straight, her expression neutral in a way that took practice. Her eyes moved first, not to my face, but down my sleeves, across my hands, lingering where the fabric had darkened. It was a slow inventory, silent but thorough. Only after it was complete did she look up. "You're late," she said. Not as a question. As a conclusion. I nodded once. I offered no explanation. Experience had taught me that explanations are invitations, to doubt, to diminish, to reinterpret. She waited, perhaps expecting one anyway. When none came, she stepped aside with visible reluctance, leaving the door open just long enough for the pause to register. The foyer was already alive with sound. Glasses, restrained laughter, the low hum of conversation tuned to impress without revealing too much. I wiped my hands again, discreetly, on the inside of my jacket. It changed nothing. She gestured toward the interior as if guiding someone through a space they didn't quite belong to. As we moved, I felt the shift before I saw it, the way conversations falter not all at once, but in fragments. One voice trails off. Another lowers. Attention gathers quietly, without anyone admitting it has moved. We entered the main room. People turned. Not openly. Just enough. Eyes moved the way they do when something doesn't match the setting. I could feel the contrast, linen, crystal, tailored certainty, against me, still carrying the highway in my clothes. Then my arrival was announced. Not with warmth. With clarity. "He's here," the host said, loud enough for the room to settle around the statement. Finally. A few smiles flickered, unsure whether they were expected. My son-in-law stood near the far end of the room, glass in hand. Our eyes met briefly. He looked away first, pretending to adjust his stance, as if disengagement were a neutral act. I scanned for a place to sit, nothing central, nothing that would demand accommodation. Just a chair near the edge, half turned away from the gathering. I took a step toward it. That was when the host spoke again. "I don't think that seat is appropriate," she said, her tone polite in the way that sharpens the words rather than softening them. "This is a formal evening." The sentence landed exactly where it was meant to. My son-in-law cleared his throat, finally acknowledging me without looking directly. He suggested I wait elsewhere, maybe freshen up. His father nodded in agreement, the way men do when they want consensus without responsibility. My daughter spoke then. Briefly. She mentioned the highway. The breakdown. The delay. Her voice carried the soft urgency of someone trying to fix something already judged beyond repair. It was dismissed with a small shake of the head. I let my hand fall from the chair. "I'll go," I said. Calmly. No edge. No performance. No one objected. I turned toward the door, aware of every eye following me, not with concern, but with the quiet curiosity reserved for exits that confirm a hierarchy. My hand was inches from the handle when the doorbell rang. The sound of the doorbell cut cleanly through the room, sharp and unexpected, like a dropped glass. I stopped with my back to everyone, hand still near the handle. For a moment, no one moved. Then the host reacted first, straightening, smoothing her expression, already recalibrating for whoever was arriving next. Headlights swept across the front windows, bright and deliberate, casting long shapes across the walls. A luxury sedan idled in the driveway, its presence commanding attention before its door even opened. I stepped aside without being asked. The woman who entered was the same one from the highway. Her coat was different now, tailored and immaculate, but the posture was unmistakable, the careful steadiness, the unhurried way she moved as if time belonged to her rather than the other way around. She paused just inside the door, letting her eyes adjust, letting the room come to her. Recognition rippled outward from the hosts in stages. Confusion first. Then certainty. Their faces shifted with practiced speed, smiles forming, bodies angling toward her, voices softening in welcome. Names were spoken with reverence. Titles followed. Whatever she represented here, it mattered. She looked past them. Her gaze found me. "There you are," she said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the room leaned in. "I was hoping you hadn't left." The hosts froze. Conversations died completely now. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was attention redirected. She turned to them, polite but direct, and mentioned the highway, the car, the repair done by hand. She spoke of it as an inconvenience to her, but a generosity on my part. She mentioned that I'd refused compensation. That I'd simply wished her a safe drive and gone on my way. Then she noticed my position, near the door, half-turned, ready to exit. "Are you leaving?" she asked. I told her the truth. That there hadn't been a seat for me. That my appearance had made things complicated. Silence settled, heavy and absolute. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She looked at the hosts and asked, plainly, why a man who had stopped on the highway to help a stranger was now being asked to stand outside a room full of people who had done nothing but watch. No one answered. She smiled then, not warmly, but with resolve. "If he goes," she said, "I go." The calculation was immediate. I could see it in their eyes. Whatever she represented, investment, partnership, influence, it outweighed their discomfort, their pride, their earlier certainty. An apology was offered. Thin. Functional. Permission was granted for me to stay. She declined. Instead, she turned back to me and asked if I would walk out with her. I did. We left together, the room behind us destabilized, conversations fractured, priorities exposed. In the days that followed, I heard about the consequences secondhand. Withdrawn support. Strained alliances. Quiet losses no one announced publicly. My relationship with my daughter changed after that. Not dramatically. But boundaries became clearer. Respect, more intentional. As for me, I returned to my life as it was, calmer for having been tested. Some lessons arrive dressed in formality. Others come covered in grease, on the side of a highway, asking nothing in return. The night didn't end when we drove away. It rarely does. The road was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles after something irreversible has happened. Streetlights passed in measured intervals, each one briefly illuminating the interior of the car before letting it fall back into shadow. She drove without hurry. I watched my hands resting in my lap, still marked, still carrying the evidence of where they had been earlier that day. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. There was no need to. Some understandings form fully without words. When she finally did speak, it wasn't about the event, or the room we'd left behind. She spoke about the car. About how she'd waited longer than she should have before pulling onto the shoulder. About how she'd considered calling for help but decided to stand outside instead, where she could see the road clearly. I wanted to know, she said quietly, who still notices. I understood what she meant. At a certain stage of life, you stop being addressed directly. You're spoken around, evaluated through proxies, titles, histories, assumptions. People decide what you're worth before you open your mouth. The highway had been honest. The room had not. We parted without ceremony. No exchange of numbers. No promises to keep in touch. Some encounters aren't meant to be extended. They exist to correct the record, not to rewrite the future. In the days that followed, my daughter called. Her voice was careful. She spoke about embarrassment, about misunderstandings, about how things had spiraled. She didn't ask me to apologize. She didn't need to. The silence between us carried enough. What changed was subtle but permanent. Invitations became clearer in their intent. Expectations were stated instead of assumed. I was no longer asked to endure quietly for the sake of appearances. Boundaries, once crossed, are easier to see the second time. I washed the suit myself. The stains didn't come out completely. I kept it anyway. Some marks are worth remembering. The following week moved more slowly than usual, as if time itself needed to reconsider its pace. I returned to routines that had always steadied me, early mornings, quiet coffee, the familiar weight of ordinary tasks. Yet something had shifted. Not outwardly. No one stopped me on the street. No messages arrived with revelations or apologies. The change was internal, and those are the ones that last. I thought about the room I'd left behind. About how quickly dignity is granted or withdrawn based on context rather than character. I thought about how easily people confuse cleanliness with worth, polish with integrity. Those thoughts didn't make me bitter. They made me precise. My daughter invited me to dinner the following Sunday. Just the three of us. No extended family. No performance. I arrived on time, dressed simply, hands clean, posture unchanged. She watched me more closely than before, not critically, but carefully, as if reassessing something she'd assumed was fixed. We spoke about small things. Work. Weather. Plans that didn't require consensus. At one point, she mentioned the gathering, only briefly, only to say that it hadn't gone as expected. I nodded. I didn't offer commentary. When people are ready to understand, they don't need explanations. After dinner, as I prepared to leave, she thanked me for coming. Not automatically. Deliberately. That was enough. On the drive home, I passed the stretch of highway where I'd pulled over days earlier. The shoulder looked no different. Cars still rushed by, absorbed in destinations they believed were more important than whatever waited just outside their lane of focus. I slowed slightly, then continued on. You don't stop every time. You just stop when it matters. Time has a way of returning things to their proper scale. A few days after that Sunday dinner, I received a message from my son-in-law. Short. Measured. He wrote as if drafting something that had already been edited in his head several times. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings. He said things had been misunderstood. He said the evening had been complicated. I read it once and didn't respond. There are moments when silence isn't avoidance, it's accuracy. Anything I said would have been either too sharp or too forgiving, and neither would have served the truth. The truth was simpler, I had been seen clearly, and then dismissed. When clarity arrives late, it doesn't undo what came before it. I went on with my life. Work filled the days. Evenings were quiet. I found myself noticing smaller things, the sound of water heating in the kettle, the way sunlight reached the edge of a kitchen table at a certain hour. These details had always been there. I was just paying attention again. The suit hung in the closet, faintly marked, a reminder without bitterness. I didn't rush to replace it. I didn't feel the need to prove readiness for rooms that required a costume to grant respect. Weeks passed. I heard, indirectly, that the gathering had consequences. Nothing dramatic. Just adjustments. Phone calls that weren't returned. Meetings postponed indefinitely. Plans reevaluated. Influence, when it withdraws quietly, leaves people scrambling without ever admitting why. My daughter didn't mention it again. She didn't have to. Our conversations grew steadier, less guarded. She asked my opinion more often. Not for validation, just for perspective. That shift mattered more than any apology. One evening, while driving home, I saw another car pulled over on the shoulder. This time, there were already 2 people helping. I kept going. Not because I wouldn't stop again, but because I no longer needed the moment to define me. Some lessons arrive loudly. Others settle in slowly, reshaping the way you move through the world without announcing themselves. And once you've learned them, you don't repeat yourself. There was a clarity that settled in afterward, the kind that doesn't announce itself but stays. I noticed it in how I moved through spaces that once demanded adjustment. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head before arriving somewhere. I stopped arriving early just to soften the impression of being present. I wore what was appropriate, not what was protective. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. My daughter and I began meeting for coffee instead of dinners. Neutral ground. No expectations attached. We talked longer there than we ever had at her table. She spoke about pressures she hadn't named before, about appearances, about aligning herself with a family that measured success in surfaces and leverage. She didn't ask me to agree. She only asked me to listen. I did. At one point she said, quietly, that she hadn't realized how alone I'd been made to feel that night. The statement wasn't wrapped in apology. It didn't need to be. Recognition, when it comes unforced, carries its own weight. I told her something I hadn't planned to say. That dignity isn't something you negotiate for entry. That the moment you accept conditional respect, you teach people how cheaply you can be priced. She nodded, not immediately, but eventually. Life returned to its ordinary shape, but with cleaner lines. I declined a few invitations without explanation. I accepted others on my terms. No one argued. That, too, was information. Every so often, I thought of the woman from the highway. Not as a figure of influence, but as a reminder. Help offered without an audience has a way of revealing who you are, and who others are, too. The world didn't change because of what happened. But my place in it did. And that was enough. What lingered most wasn't the humiliation. That faded quickly. Humiliation always does once it's named for what it is, someone else's fear dressed as judgment. What stayed with me was the moment before it all turned. The quiet certainty I felt when I chose not to explain myself. That was new. For most of my life, I had believed that clarity came from being understood. I was wrong. Clarity comes from understanding yourself well enough not to chase approval when it's withheld. I began to see how often I had been accommodating in ways that cost me nothing individually but accumulated into something heavier over time. Waiting. Adjusting. Letting small slights pass because addressing them felt like more effort than they were worth. That night had compressed all of that into a single scene I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, weeks later, my daughter called and asked if I would attend another event, smaller this time, hosted by colleagues rather than family. She said she wanted me there. Not because it would look good. Because it would feel right. I told her I would come if I felt like it that day. She accepted that without hesitation. When the evening arrived, I did go. I arrived clean, composed, and entirely unconcerned with how I might be received. No one inspected me. No one announced me. Conversation unfolded naturally, without calibration. It struck me then how little effort genuine respect requires when it isn't manufactured. On the drive home, I thought again of the highway. Of how stopping had delayed me just enough to reveal a truth I might otherwise have missed. Timing has its own intelligence. It disrupts us when we're ready to see something clearly. I don't seek those moments out. I don't romanticize them. I simply recognize them when they arrive. Life resumed its quiet rhythm. And within that rhythm, I found something steadier than approval. I found my footing again. There was a moment, some time later, when I realized the story had stopped belonging to anyone else. It happened on an ordinary morning. I was standing in line at a cafe, watching the barista move with practiced ease, when a man ahead of me spilled his coffee. Nothing dramatic, just enough to stain his sleeve and draw a sharp breath of frustration. He muttered an apology to no one in particular, already embarrassed, already shrinking. I watched the familiar pattern begin. The instinct to explain. To justify. To minimize the inconvenience of existing imperfectly in a public space. He didn't need saving. But he needed time. So I waited. Let him reset. The barista smiled. Someone handed him napkins. The moment passed without judgment because no one rushed to assign one. That was when it struck me, the power I'd felt on the highway, and later in that room, hadn't come from doing something exceptional. It came from not abandoning myself in the face of discomfort, mine or anyone else's. I thought about how often we're taught to make ourselves smaller to preserve harmony. How often dignity is framed as something granted rather than maintained. I had spent years believing that if I stayed reasonable enough, quiet enough, agreeable enough, respect would follow. What I learned instead was simpler, and harder: respect follows presence. And presence doesn't ask permission. My daughter and I spoke less often than before, but more honestly. There was space now. Space where neither of us rushed to fill silence with reassurance or explanation. When she asked for my opinion, she listened. When she didn't, I let it be. That balance felt earned. Occasionally, I replayed the night in my mind, not with resentment, but with distance. I could see each choice clearly now, where I had stood, where I had paused, where I had left. None of it embarrassed me anymore. It felt like a clean line drawn at the right time. Some people spend their lives waiting for a moment that justifies them. Others never notice when it arrives. I didn't miss mine. And once you've recognized a moment like that, you don't need another one. What surprised me most was how little I needed to explain afterward. There were no follow-up conversations where I defended my choices. No private reckonings where I laid out timelines or motives. People drew their own conclusions, and for once, I let them. I had spent enough years correcting misunderstandings that were never accidental to begin with. One afternoon, my daughter asked me something that caught me off guard. We were sitting across from each other, coffee cooling between us, when she asked how I'd known to leave when I did that night. Not when I was told to. Not when the apology came. But exactly when I stood up and turned toward the door. I told her the truth. That there comes a point when staying teaches people the wrong lesson. That dignity isn't preserved by endurance alone. Sometimes it's preserved by withdrawal. She didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, watching people pass, some rushing, some unhurried, all of them convinced they were moving towards something important. Eventually, she nodded. Not because she fully agreed, but because she understood enough. After that, I noticed she made quieter choices. She arrived places a little later. Left a little earlier. Declined things she once would have accepted automatically. It wasn't rebellion. It was discernment. As for me, I felt no urge to revisit the past. The night had done its work. It had clarified where I stood, not in that family's hierarchy, not in their calculations, but in my own life. There's a relief that comes with that kind of clarity. You stop negotiating internally. You stop wondering if you should have said more, or stayed longer, or tried harder. You realize the effort was never the issue. I drove that same highway often after that. Each time, I glanced at the shoulder without thinking. Sometimes there was nothing there. Sometimes there was. I didn't look for meaning in it anymore. Meaning had already found me. The distance that followed wasn't empty. It was intentional. I stopped explaining myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. That alone freed up more time than I expected. Time has a way of returning to you when you stop spending it on performances that were never meant to be appreciated. My daughter adjusted, slowly. I could see it in how she spoke about her husband's family, less defensive, more observational. She stopped translating their behavior for me. Stopped asking me to interpret silences or soften implications. She let things be what they were, and in doing so, she let herself off the hook. There was one afternoon when she admitted, almost casually, that she hadn't realized how much she'd been managing everyone else's comfort. Not just mine. Everyone's. The room. The mood. The narrative. It was exhausting her in ways she hadn't named before. I didn't tell her what to do. I didn't need to. Awareness does most of the work on its own once it arrives. As for my son-in-law, our interactions became rare and surface level. Polite. Efficient. He no longer attempted to bridge the gap with explanations. I suspect he sensed that the window for that had passed. Some moments, once missed, don't reopen. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I'd expected resentment to linger, but it didn't. What replaced it was something steadier, a refusal to participate in dynamics that required my quiet diminishment. One evening, while sorting through old things, I found a jacket I hadn't worn in years. The pocket still carried faint traces of work, dust, a small smear I'd never quite removed. I held it for a moment longer than necessary, then hung it back up. Not everything needs to be clean to be kept. The world continued, as it always does. Invitations came and went. Some I accepted. Some I didn't. No explanations attached. And in that quiet selectivity, I felt something settle that I hadn't realized had been restless for a long time. Peace, when it arrives honestly, doesn't ask you to prove you deserve it. There was a final shift that I didn't notice right away. It showed up in ordinary decisions, the ones that used to carry a faint weight of hesitation. I stopped checking my calendar twice before declining an invitation. I stopped rehearsing polite refusals in my head. When something didn't feel right, I trusted that instinct without needing to justify it to myself first. That trust was new. One evening, my daughter called just to talk. No agenda. No update to deliver. We spoke about work, about a book she was reading, about nothing in particular. Near the end of the call, she said something quietly, almost as if testing the words. I think I've been afraid of disappointing people who were never really seeing me. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I disagreed, but because she didn't need confirmation. She had already arrived at the thought on her own. When she did speak again, her voice was steadier, lighter. As if naming it had loosened something. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet of my living room. The light outside had dimmed, leaving the familiar outlines of furniture softened at the edges. I realized then that the night of the gathering had done more than expose a fault line, it had interrupted a pattern. Not just for me, but for her as well. We don't always get to correct the past. But occasionally, we get to stop it from repeating. I thought again of the woman on the highway. Of how she'd said she wanted to know who still notices. I wondered how many people walk through their days waiting for confirmation that they still matter, while rooms full of power fail to recognize them. The answer, I realized, isn't to seek those rooms. It's to become the kind of person who doesn't disappear when they're ignored. By the time I went to bed that night, the story had settled into something complete. Not dramatic. Not triumphant. Just finished. The weeks that followed carried no surprises, and that was its own kind of confirmation. Life settled into a pattern that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Mornings arrived quietly. Evenings ended without the need to decompress from rooms that demanded performance. I hadn't removed myself from the world, I had simply narrowed the parts of it I was willing to stand in. My daughter and I met less often, but when we did, there was an ease between us that hadn't existed before. We no longer circled certain topics. We didn't avoid them either. They simply took up the space they deserved and no more. Respect, I learned, doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up in how little you have to brace yourself. One afternoon, she told me she'd declined hosting a gathering with her husband's family. She didn't frame it as a stand or a protest. She just said it didn't feel necessary. That was all. I recognized the tone immediately, the calm that follows a decision made without bargaining. I didn't congratulate her. I didn't warn her. I trusted her judgment. That trust moved both ways. As for me, I stopped measuring my presence by how it was received. I arrived when I chose to. I left when I was done. I paid attention to where I was welcome without negotiation. Everything else fell away on its own. I drove that highway again one evening, late, the road nearly empty. I thought about stopping at the shoulder where it had all begun, just to look. I didn't. There was nothing left there for me. The meaning had already been carried forward. Some events feel important because of how loudly they end. Others matter because of how quietly they close. That night had closed cleanly. And I carried on, unburdened. There is a quiet satisfaction that comes when nothing more needs to happen. No follow-up. No reckoning. No final conversation where everything is neatly resolved. Life rarely offers that kind of symmetry, and I've learned not to wait for it. What matters is what settles afterward, what stays when the noise has faded. I still think about that evening from time to time, but not with any sense of unfinished business. I remember it the way you remember a long walk that changed your breathing. The details are there, but the strain is gone. What remains is the adjustment you didn't realize you needed until it happened. I didn't become harder after that night. If anything, I became more exact. I noticed sooner when a space required me to diminish myself for the sake of harmony. I noticed when politeness was being used as a tool rather than a courtesy. And when I noticed, I chose differently. My relationship with my daughter continues, steady and unforced. We don't pretend the world is kinder than it is, but we also don't let it define us. There's a mutual understanding now, unspoken, but present, that respect is not something we trade away for access. As for the rest of my life, it looks much the same as it did before. Same roads. Same routines. Same quiet mornings. But I move through them with a lighter step, no longer carrying the need to be received well in rooms that were never meant for me. Sometimes, doing the right thing stains your sleeves and costs you time. Sometimes it gets you turned away at a door. And sometimes, rarely, it reveals everything you needed to know about yourself and the people around you. I wouldn't change a thing. Because in the end, I didn't lose a seat at a table. I gained my footing. And I've been standing on it ever since.